Hi there, and welcome to this video. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Ed, and I teach art, and I'm also an artist myself. I go out and paint. I'm based in Ipswich, in Suffolk, and I'm not quite sure now, over 15 years now, I've been teaching art at various locations in Ipswich, mainly to adults. I did a whole series of videos during lockdown, and then I haven't really uploaded a great deal since. But I felt inspired. I'd been actually watching a few of my old videos back again last term, and I thought, oh, I really enjoyed doing that. So I thought this term, what I would do is change my format slightly. And I'm thinking more of my students in my art classes. So what I normally do is at the beginning of a class, I give a 15 or 20-minute intro on a subject related to art. Sometimes I do a demonstration painting. Sometimes I talk about a subject, and then they get on with the painting. Sort of go around and have a chat with them on a one-to-one basis. So what I thought I would do for this term, just to see how it goes, is I thought I would do my introduction phase in this format, and then I can send that out to all my students. And of course, when I do my classes, we can recap on the information and just see if there's any questions. But it gives an opportunity for those that perhaps can't make the class, or for those of you that are perhaps just watching because it's come up in your feed, maybe some ideas to work with. So there might be a value to some of you outside of my classes. Okay, so that's what I thought I would do. So each term I do a different subject. It tends to sort of go through similar themes on a yearly basis. And this term we're looking at landscape painting, as you can see from my image behind me. So landscape painting is one of my favorite subjects, and since I really started painting seriously myself, I would say it was one of the main things that I've done outside of my classes. I like to go outside, I like to do plein air painting, and I love learning about landscape painting and how I can develop my own practice. And yes, and I like to share that with other people. So hopefully you'll find something of value here. Okay, so the theme of this is my first lesson, and the theme this week is about inspiration and doing master copies. Okay, so it's really important whether you are painting at home or you're sort of like, you've already got a painting practice, is every now and again you really need to try and tune into your inspiration. And you'll know this when it comes along. Sometimes you can go a bit flat with your painting and you're sort of going through the motions. Every now and again, though, you might be at a gallery or someone shows you a painting, and or you might just be at a local sort of art show and you see someone's something, the way they've framed it up, or something just captures your imagination. And for me, when that happens, before I know it, I've gone outside and I've started painting, or I've gone up to my studio and actually started work. So there's something about, sometimes you just see in a painting, it just gives you a clue as to how you want to proceed. And it can also, for me, it generates quite a lot of energy. The energy to go out there, to push through, whereas before you might have felt a bit blocked. Inspiration really helps to get you moving and yes, get some energy behind what you're doing. So as we're starting a term, and this is quite a long term, for some of you this will be maybe 13 or 14 weeks. It's really good to start off and really sort of dial in that inspiration. So this is my suggestion for you this week, is I want you to find some inspiration, find some paintings that you like, try to analyze why you like them. And then for this week, we're going to do a master copy. So I will say a little bit more about how to go about that in a minute. What I thought might be useful to do is just to talk a little bit about some of my own experience with getting inspired. And this experience of having this sort of vision or seeing something in a piece of work that really got me motivated. And again, if you look at artist biographies, you'll hear about artists having these experiences. I mean, I remember Francis Bacon. I think I read that he saw some drawings Picasso had done with these sort of, they were sort of abstractions of the human figure, sort of slightly blobby sort of figures. And something about it really captured his imagination. And, I came across his work sort of independently. But once I knew that piece of the puzzle, he liked Picasso, he'd been looking at Picasso, you just start to see how um, artists are continually, they get inspiration from other artists. There's a great book I reference called Steal Like an Artist, and it just makes explicit this idea that artists are always looking at the world, and obviously stealing might not be the right, but they're looking for ideas and inspiration that can feed into their own work. And so when we're working with our own practice, I think it's really important that we sort of take that seriously. Um, there's an idea in art which is that you just observe. You simply set up your easel or you get a reference photo and you just try to replicate that as accurately as possible. And I would say there certainly is a time and a place for observation and developing the skill of just being able to see the world and match colours and get proportions and all of those. But then there's also a time where you have to think, what do I actually want to say? What's the mood? What's the atmosphere that I'm trying to create? And some of that might come across through looking at other artists' work. So this background behind me, this is by an artist who I've only recently come across. Let's see, Russell Chatham. Okay. And yeah, that came across through looking at another artist. He was giving a talk. He mentioned some of his inspirations, and he mentioned this Russell Chatham. And I'd never come across his work, so this is only in the last week or so. And I was instantly struck. It had a lot of the elements that I appealed to me. And so I did a bit of a deep dive on his work. And so, yes, in terms of my own practice, I may well do a master copy of one of his at some point and see what I can learn. Okay, so now I'm just going to go through some of the paintings that have inspired me. Okay, so here we are. So I'm going to go through a few artists that have inspired me over the years. So starting with this chap behind me, unfortunately, this is a rather sort of sad story. This is my good friend James, who sadly died a year or so ago. But he certainly inspired me a lot when I was learning to paint. So I met James around about when I was doing my A levels at the time, and he was a friend. We had a mutual friend who'd moved to Ipswich, and so I got to know him that way. And when people introduced James, they would often mention the fact that he was a great artist. And as I was also interested in art, I sort of, got to know him. I was interested in what he did, and yes, I think he was a great artist. And we then went on to we went to art school together. We had a couple of years there before he eventually went to university in London. No, he didn't go to London, but he ended up eventually living in London and carried on painting. And here you can see him at work in his studio. So yes, knowing James and seeing his work for me was very inspirational. And James's father, Lawrence Self, was also a really successful artist, also a very highly regarded artist, and he taught at the Ipswich Art School where I went for a couple of years, although he was a bit before I went. But when I was, say, in my late teens, I would spend quite a lot of time visiting my friend James, and we would spend time sort of sitting around in his front room. and he lived in a small sort of, it's like almost like a cottage-like house out in Rattlesden, in the Suffolk countryside. And in the house were loads of his dad's paintings in frames. And I think that had a really big effect on me. I think it wasn't just the fact that the artwork really sort of inspired me, but also seeing art on the wall in location, a bit like going to, if ever you've been to Kettle's Yard in Cambridge, actually seeing art in a domestic setting as opposed to a sort of white wall gallery. That really affected me. And I just thought, being surrounded by art is a very uplifting thing. And living with a painting is very different than just going to an art gallery and, looking at some paintings. To actually have one on the wall and sort of have it sort of soak in over the years, like looking at it and thinking about it. Yes, I think it has. It's a different effect than just that sort of quick, like looking at, say, some Monets when they're visiting London or something like that. So yes, James's dad was a big inspiration. This is another one of his, probably painted, not far away from Rattlesden. And yeah, I mean, this idea about getting inspiration is you have to ask yourself why. And so when I look at a painting like this, I think, what is it I like about it? Sometimes that's not obvious. But you have to, what I like when I look at this now is I like the simplicity of it. I like the muted colors, which you'll see through a few of my choices. I like the sense of perspective. And James's dad and James both had a very, what I'd call an expressionistic sort of approach to painting, in that they painted quite quickly. And so their marks have a very expressive, sort of almost energetic feel to them. So when I'd be looking at that, I'd be thinking, yes, I like the mark making, I like the color palettes, I like the simplicity of the design. And so, yes, this is how you sort of learn from other artists. So this next one, this is by one of my tutors when I was at the Ipswich Art School. This is a painting by Richard Scott, who sadly died probably in his 80s. He lived in Walberswick, and so a lot of his paintings were of that area. And I went and saw an exhibition of his work at a gallery in a place called Chapel, which is outside past Colchester, towards London. And it had a really big effect on me. And I think I hadn't long been painting sort of more seriously myself. And one of the things that struck me was that these weren't large paintings. He worked in a fairly small format. And again, a bit like Lawrence's paintings, you can see a rather subdued color palette, and yet it's full of like atmosphere and mood. And this is a sort of a ruined church, sort of somewhere out near Walberswick. Again, it's almost like a silhouette design, but it's very sort of carefully considered, very simple. And we see the little birds sort of flying into roost there, really giving the feeling of a sort of evening scene. So yes, so I liked his work, Richard Scott. This is Fred Cumming, who is or was, again, sadly no longer with us. I'd say he's a British sort of, maybe you could call him an impressionist sort of a painter. But I came across his work quite early on. Again, I was in a secondhand bookshop and I found this great book called A Painter's Progress. And it had some really good paintings in, but particularly Fred's paintings in there really captured my interest. And I think it was just something to do with the marks he made, the mark making. I could almost see myself. I thought, yeah, I could make those marks. So there was something that felt sort of liberating or inviting. Sometimes some paintings are so good, or so sort of like so polished, that you just think, well, I'd never be able to do that. But there was something about Fred Cummings' paintings that, yeah, they just felt they were great, but their marks and the way they were executed seemed like inviting me to sort of have a go. And so, yes, his work really inspired me and still does. So he's one I've been sort of revisiting. This is another one of his. So he painted a lot at a place called Camber Sands, but did a lot of these sort of coastal scenes. As you can see, the land, really the whole thing is stripped down to a very sort of simple composition, and really you're looking at a sort of skyscape there, where the emphasis is on mood, atmosphere. Again, you've got these great marks, sort of suggesting the clouds breaking up. And again, so I think one thing that this idea of inspiration, for me, often it's just about the mood, the atmosphere. And then if I'm trying to think about my own painting, it's, well, you know, what have they done? What is it that creates that mood? I think here it's something to do with simplicity. So I'm sure those of you that come to my class will perhaps recognize this. This is an Edward Seago. So Edward Seago, again, I hadn't been painting that long. I'd never heard of Edward Seago all the way through university. No one really mentioned him. And one day I was in Waterstone's bookshop, and there on the shelves were these two quite large books of Edward Seago's paintings, and I had a skim through, and I snapped them up because they just really spoke to me. And again, what Edward Seago is sort of is now regarded as a bit like a painter's painter, in that you can learn a lot about painting and how to make images by looking at Edward Seago. So just by doing master copies of Edward Seago, you would learn a lot. And although they are executed with a certain sort of freedom, if I sort of zoom up here, again, you can actually see the marks. Looks incredibly simple. Of course, if you actually try and do it, it turns out not to be as straightforward as it looks. But again, they just give you that feeling of someone who's enjoying themselves, someone who's painting, and there's a sort of freedom there. But again, he knows how to break down the subject, to simplify it. And just the way the light catches that tree trunk there, and this little bit of light. But again, you look at all this, it's all subdued. But again, he's an artist that is doing a lot with mark making. So again, obviously it must be something that appeals to me. Maybe it's something that appeals to you. It's something about mark making. But the mark making is done within, if we sort of zoom out, you know, there's no confusion about what this image is. You know, it's the drawing and the planning of it. It's still very much in the grounds of realism, and yet there's a lot of these design choices have been made to make this painting work. Another Seago. Again, we can see a very simple scene, you know, something you might walk by on a walk, and you would maybe not think too much of it, but again, very simple sky, nice diagonal at the top there, all these sort of diagonals, the rhythm of it. But again, if any of you have had a go at it, the way he's done these branches, for example, with what looks like, you know, just a few brush marks, perfectly captures the feeling of these twigs. And again, you know, you have to sort of just be amazed, really, because when you try to do these things, to get the paint to break and have the right sort of like thick and thin and all that sort of stuff, they are amazing. But they still somehow, they're inspirational, and I think it's something to do with the simplicity, and he really gets down to the essence of a scene. So I would, you know, if it was me, I would say look at Edward Seago, and I'm sure you'll find something there to be inspired by. So this is a painting by William Nicholson, who's another artist I really admire. More known for his sort of still life painting, but he was an excellent landscape painter as well. And again, here, what do we see? We see sort of fairly muted colours, really very little going on in this foreground, maybe just the suggestions of some detail. But look how small these houses, how small these details are. And the size of those, that communicates depth. It communicates a sense of space. And the fact that these clouds up here, again, they're not white. You know, the whitest white is reserved for the buildings, but we have these sort of grey clouds. So again, this one's not particularly sort of expressive brushwork, although you can, it has the feeling of something that's been painted outdoor on location. But again, it's the muted simplicity of the colours, the sort of variation of the buildings. And so again, it's another sort of a sort of masterclass in really this idea that less is more. And then this is, again, slightly different. So this is a painter called Atkinson Grimshaw, who I think was a painter from the north of England and famous for these. He would do these sort of moonlit scenes, often involving boats, and incredibly popular painter in his time. And again, quite different though from some of these previous ones in that we can see a much more sort of literal rendering of the objects. So we don't have quite the expressive brushwork that we had before. But look at these. I mean, the way these twigs have been done, you know, is amazing if you like that sort of detail. So there's no sense of there's no unlike the Seago, there's no broken paint, there's no rough execution. Things are done realistically. However, you know, how many times would you have to go out on an evening before you saw this particular arrangement of the moon breaking out just at this spot below, you know, with the water? So this, I would say, is a painting that has been designed. It uses the natural world, but it is done deliberately to create mood and atmosphere. So there are choices made about these colours. Now, you might say, well, maybe he just got lucky. He took his easel out one day and the colour was like that. But I would say my guess is that that's not the case, and that these colours and the whole thing is part of a design process. And that's one of the things I'm hoping to go over or to get into this term, is to really think about how do we design a painting and not just simply allow, you know, what's in front of us to dictate to us what we do. We need to think about, what am I trying to say and how can I say that and how can I design a painting? So we'll get into composition, but as you can see, this one uses something a bit like a circle. If you can see the way these diagonals come in and round and at the top, and so we're sort of, our eye is led into the painting. Okay, so that's a circular composition. So again, these things are all, we have to, it helps to assume these are deliberate choices. But Atkinson Grimshaw is another one I would have a look at. And here we've got Whistler. So again, Whistler's one that I have been aware of over the years, but only in the last few weeks I've been sort of looking through Whistler's paintings and really sort of seeing again some very nice sort of ideas for painting. So one of the things is, often I talk about working on a toned ground. So if we look in here, we can just see this perhaps warm, almost maybe a burnt umber wash or something like that. So Whistler's paintings, he uses this effect of, they're almost like glazes. It's almost transparent colour. And it creates again this very sort of moody atmospheric effect. So we've got almost like these greens and greys in the sky. So it's an amazing study of color, and just the suggestion of these waves breaking and a little boat out to the distance there. Um, Again, very simple design. You see, look, also we have this dark shape in the foreground. So, you take that away. Like if I just hide it there. See, suddenly it's just, you've got this flag composition and it could just take your eye out. But, if we add that in, you see it creates a bit of foreground. It creates a sort of tension between that and the boat. So again, these artists, although this might look accidental, they're all done with design choices. And then another whistler. Basically a monochrome painting here, and very few hard edges, really all about sort of mood and atmosphere. And yeah, I think that's one of the things I really like. But of course, what I'm not saying that you take my ideas, is what I really want you to do is I want you to find your own inspiration. So let's just move that there. Let's just say a little bit, this is how I would go about it, as to how are you going to find your own inspiration. So a good friend of mine, he said to me that when you get bored of painting, one good thing to do is just to start looking at art. Look at art, and you will find eventually you're going to see something, and it's going to sort of get things going again. So ways you can do that is, next time you're in town, go into a secondhand bookshop, or a secondhand shop, go to the books and see if you can find, could be art books, could be how to paint, it could be reference images. You could find something. I had a very good book that I came across last term or last year, villages in Provence or castles, or something that sort of gets you sort of interested, some sort of theme. Another thing is to go to exhibitions. Even going around Christchurch Mansion in Ipswich would be a good option. Or you could go to Cambridge, the Fitzwilliams got some great art. Or you could go and see some contemporary art. You could go to Aldborough, go to Thompson's, have a look around there. And again, you're now looking not just passively, you're trying to find, what is it that I like, what interests me, okay? And then also, like these days, you could go on Instagram, and start to look at art, look at artists, hashtag, plein air painting or tonal painting, or and you start to connect with artists, and that puts you in contact with other artists, and you're trying to create this sort of branching effect where one thing leads to another, okay? And then my suggestions are, is, find the image that inspires you, and then you're going to make a commitment this week to have a go at doing a master copy painting. Okay. Now, I've just got a few, this thing about doing a master copy. So what I would say there is, copying paintings was not something that I was really encouraged to do when I was learning to paint. So from A levels to my foundation years, then going on to university, we were sort of encouraged to look at other artists, but the idea of actually doing a copy had really sort of fallen out of favour. Anyway, I've got a few notes here I was going to just share with you about the history of master copies. So if you go back to antiquity and the classical world, in Greece and Rome, places like that, copying was essential for basically preserving ideas. So if someone creates one thing, then a way to, unless you take that thing to another location, you sort of have to learn how to copy things if you want to, say you want to do a mosaic and take it to another part of the world. You learn through copying. So it was very much seen as the way to learn, things. Then you had in the medieval period, artists would copy manuscripts, so books would have to be copied. And religious books particularly would be copied and embellished, and as some of you know, so there's the Book of Kells, and there was this tradition of these sort of like incredibly illuminated manuscripts, and so a lot of that sort of theory and practice came about through one artist copying another, adding their own little bits, and so on. And then when we get into places like the Renaissance, so that's like 1400s, again, the system of apprenticeship, that would have all been based on copying. And that really carried all the way through to the ateliers and sort of academic training in places like France and in this country. And you would work from classical drawings. You would have plaster copies of figures, and you would do a lot of copying before you even got on to making your own paintings. And I think there's a lot to be said for it as a practice. You learn a lot, and you also really get to you sort of it's a bit like learning a different language. In learning a different language, you sort of absorb some of the mindset of different people, and copying another artist, you sort of get more of a sense of how they see the world and what they've decided to prioritize and make important. So what we're really looking to do is focus a little bit on this idea of inspiration. So when you do your copy, my suggestion is to print an image out, or use your tablet. And the accuracy of the copy, that's not really of primary importance. Historically, apparently, though, it did used to be a way for up-and-coming artists to sort of show off their skills. So, if you could pass off a good copy, it would sort of like, people would be interested in your town or village, and that might be a way to sort of get commissions and sort of start to build a reputation. But we're not really interested so much in that for our purposes. What we want to do is we're copying with the idea of extracting the ideas that we can then take into our own work. So if, for example, I was copying this Whistler painting behind me, I'd be paying particular attention to the application of the paint. In an ideal world, I would go to somewhere where I could actually see a Whistler and try and look at it up close, and try to get a sense of, is he painting it thick? And I think actually Whistler was painting more through a sort of thin, like glazing effect, almost like watercolor, very sort of thin paint maybe applied in a sort of series of layers. So I'd be looking at my color mixing, application of paint, and what I'd be thinking is, look at this is all silhouettes. So if I was going to take this into my own work, I'd be thinking, well, I'll go out maybe in the evening and see, can I find some interesting silhouettes where I could apply this approach to? Okay. And you might find, say, for some people, it might be the colors. So you might be looking at, are they using very bright, intense colors? And you're sort of trying to create a library of ideas. And so, although we're going to do this first week with the master copy, try to keep the whole thing ticking along alongside this term, and try to feed it into your work, because landscape painting is a very broad subject. And in order to get the most out of it, it's good to sort of like limit your options a bit. So you might say to yourself, okay, I'm going to try to paint, I'm going to pick a couple of artists. So I might go back to, Richard Scott. Let's see. Yes, that was the William Nicholson. You know, pick a couple of artists and sort of try to sort of think, okay, I'm going to try and paint a little bit in this style. I'm going to leave it open for my own stuff to come through, but I'm really going to sort of try to drill down in a particular approach. So I'm not going to go and set up my easel in the middle of Ipswich where I've got like people walking and cars parked, and I'm going to find these very sort of simple scenes out in the countryside as my reference images. Okay, so that's what I would suggest. So there we go. So that's it. So that's your main jobs this week are get inspired, find some images, if possible, bring them in and show me, and then try and do a master copy. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the classes, about how you can go about that. I'll be giving you a hand. And then at the end of the week, I will try to invite people. Maybe you're watching this and you're thinking, and you don't come to my classes and you're thinking you want to take part. By all means, you can email me at edcooper76@gmail.com. You can email me if you do any paintings. And what I'll do is I'll pick a few out at the end of the week and maybe do a little bit of a review, and we can have a look at you know, how people have got on, because I think it's a great thing to do and a really good way to sort of kickstart your inspiration for the term ahead. Okay, so I hope you found some of that useful and it's given you some ideas, and I will see you again soon. Cheers. Bye.